Great. So as I mentioned, my name's Wendy Sukier and I lead the Diversity Institute, also a number of projects that this webinar is relevant to, including the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and the 50/30 Challenge. I want to start by acknowledging that we're joining you today from across the country, all of us on Indigenous lands. And I myself am joining you from the traditional unceded territory of Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. And many of you are aware that our organization has gone through a fairly intensive process to address issues around truth and reconciliation, and that's why we're now known as Toronto Metropolitan University. And the work that we do at the Diversity Institute, as well as the work that we're doing on supplier diversity and the issues we're going to talk about today, are certainly part of the commitments around truth and reconciliation, particularly with respect to economic opportunities for Indigenous peoples and their communities. So we're going to have a really lively discussion. We have some amazing experts and champions of supplier diversity on the panel today. And we have a great audience that includes academics, large corporations, as well as people from government and lots of entrepreneurs who are probably here to learn more about what the opportunities might be. We see this as the beginning of a conversation, and so we'll try to make lots of time for questions and answers at the end, but we will follow up with you as well with additional information, links, and materials, so that don't feel that you have to walk away from this 1 hour with absolutely everything. And I know that I speak for everybody who's joined the panel today when I say that people are very interested in sharing more and having the conversation. So what we're trying to do today is level set, make sure people understand what diverse procurement is and why it's important. Look at what some of the challenges and opportunities are, both for small, medium enterprises, but also for the customers, whether they're public sector or private sector, to think about what some of the best practices are. What are some of the examples, the impacts of supplier diversity, and to really share some practical tips for folks moving forward. And for those of you who are academics, perhaps studying entrepreneurship, you know, a lot of attention has been focused on financing, access to financing, barriers in terms of access to financing. But my view is access to customers is just as important, and this is an area that really warrants more investigation. So I'd like to start by introducing the panel. I'm just going to give their name and their title, and then I'll turn it over to them to tell you more about themselves and their organization. So we have Daryl Sherman, who is the CEO and co-founder of the CGLCC, which is Canada's 2S LGBTQI+ Chamber of Commerce. We also have Cassandra Dorrington, who is the president and CEO of the Canadian Aboriginal and Minority Supplier Council, here today. We have Natalie Adams, who's the director of supply chain with the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. We have Stephanie Fontaine, who's the regional director for Canada and the US of We Connect International. And we also have with us, yikes. Catherine Groves, sorry, Catherine, who is the manager of corporate membership for We Be Canada. And some of you may know what all those organizations do, but not all of you do. So we'll start by just going through the panelists, and they can introduce themselves and the organization. And I see Natalie is first on my screen. So Natalie, do you want to introduce yourself and CCAB?
I just got worried I wouldn't be able to unmute myself, but Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Natalie Adams, and like Wendy said, I'm the director of the Supply Chain Program here at CCAB. That's the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. So we are a nonprofit organization. We're governed by a group of voluntary board members made up of our patrons and Indigenous business members and other senior industry leaders. So we get our supports through corporate funding, event sponsorship, and membership dues, and some support comes from the government for our research and program teams. And our mission is to promote and enhance a prosperous Indigenous economy. So we do this by providing tools and training. We have a research team that does policy briefs and recommendations for government. We have major business awards. We have networking events, and then some national events, as well as some programming like Supply Change. So Supply Change is our trademarked Indigenous procurement program. Specifically, what we are trying to do is ensure that Indigenous businesses are equal participants in the Canadian economy. And the number one way to do that is through procurement. So Indigenous businesses, closing the economic gaps, I think, between Indigenous people and the non-Indigenous population is not just an exercise in supplier diversity. It must be seen for what it is, which is economic reconciliation. So economic reconciliation, if you're looking for a definition, is really the process of making economic amends for the historical injustices to Indigenous people. So throughout history, the relationship between Indigenous and settler economies has often been strained. But it's really critical to keep this historical backdrop and its ramifications in mind when you're working with Indigenous organizations or communities and firms, because while a lot has been done, there is still much more to do on the path to long-term economic reconciliation, which is really where Indigenous procurement is rooted. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks so much. And it's worth noting that Indigenous, we've done some research with CCAB on Indigenous entrepreneurs, Indigenous owned businesses, and so on. And they're actually in most sectors of the economy. So the opportunities for Indigenous businesses to contribute to supply chains is massive. So over to you, Daryl. I see you next.
Great. Thanks so much, Wendy, and good morning, good afternoon. So my name is Daryl Sherman. My pronouns are he and him. I am the CEO and co-founder of the CGLCC, which is Canada's 2S LGBTQI+ Chamber of Commerce. So similarly, our mandate is to really help to economically empower the 2S LGBTQI+ business community. And we do that through a variety of different programs and services, all really aimed at helping to provide access and support for these LGBT-owned businesses to grow and succeed. And a big component of that is obviously why we're here today, which is talking about supplier diversity. So in Canada, we act as a certifying body for LGBTQ-owned businesses. And so we are a national nonprofit organization. And so we work with corporations and governments to help to connect those diverse LGBT-owned businesses with procurement opportunities. And so I know we're going to delve into that obviously here. Just also want to mention that we are also the stewards of a very large federal program that launched last year. So with the support of the federal government, we rolled out the 2S LGBTQI+ entrepreneurship program, which is a $25 million commitment by the federal government to support strengthening the ecosystem. So really making sure that there are organizations across the country to support LGBT entrepreneurs. Also to increase the amount of data and knowledge around the barriers and the landscape of the business community here in Canada. And then obviously to help to develop and deliver additional programs and support for these businesses. So over the next 3 years, you're going to see a lot coming out specifically to support LGBT businesses as they continue to grow and succeed. So maybe I'll leave it there, Wendy.
Great, thanks so much. And Catherine, over to you. You're muted, Catherine.
Sorry, thank you. I forget about my headset sometimes. Well, first of all, thank you for having us here today and having me. I'm Catherine Gross. A little bit about myself, my background. I worked for a financial institution for 40 plus years before I retired in December 2020, where I spent the last 15 years at that financial institution, either in a lead role or a support role with their supplier diversity program across Canada and the United States. When I retired in December 2020, I came over to WB Canada to help with the support and support their membership base. WeBe Canada is a nonprofit organization, and we too are governed by our board of directors, who are made up of our corporate partners and members. Our goal here at WB Canada is to certify and scale up Canadian women-owned businesses by providing them access to corporate and government membership, training, and networking opportunities, whether it be through events within our magazine articles for our magazine that we have that comes out quarterly from WeBe Canada, and much more that we have to offer them to help them move their business to that next level.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Cassandra.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, all. Thank you very much, Wendy and team, for having me here. Let me tell you a few things about CAMC. We are a not-for-profit organization. We are in our 20th year of operation. Hard to believe it's been that long. Our whole focus is around champion business relationships and driving economic growth for Indigenous and or racialized owned businesses throughout Canada, whether it be corporate Canada and or government and beyond. I say and beyond, in the last number of years, we've done a lot of work with taking our supply base and trying to get into the US, into an international space, as well as into a global space. We have connections globally, whether it be South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, China. And we're trying to make sure that those businesses who are able to go beyond borders are able to do just that. Much as you've heard from some of the others, what we do is we work with our suppliers through the lens of certifying connections, developing and advocating for their connection into the supply chain. We also, on the other side, work with corporate and our government, helping them to build a robust supplier development program that enables them then to connect into the suppliers. So much as Wendy talked about access to capital, we're more focused on, once you have the capital, you've built your business, how do you get in the supply chain? How does that really drive the growth? And so we'll talk more about what a robust economy in Canada looks like when it includes all of us. So thank you very much for that.
That's great. Thank you. And last but not least, Stephanie.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you for including me in this panel. So I'm Stephanie Fontaine, and since 2019, I've been with We Connect International. So like some of the others, we're also a nonprofit, global, led by our corporate members. So we partner with the corporations as well as the government to bring to them qualified women-owned suppliers around the world. So we currently have 190 plus, the number keeps growing, multinational buyers with 4 trillion in annual purchasing power combined. And all of these organizations are with us because they've committed to sourcing more products and services from women-owned businesses in over 135 markets around the world. So our mission is one that I really, can relate to. It's that we help drive money into the hands of women business owners by enabling them to compete in the global marketplace. And for us, global means, local to Canada. You want to grow here, we will help you, but you also want to grow regionally as well as internationally. We do offer that network. So we around the world, we identify, educate, register, as well as certify women's business enterprises that are at least 51% owned, managed, and controlled by one or more women. So again, happy to be here. I'll keep it at that because I know we have a lot of great questions coming up.
Yeah, and I wanted to make sure that, in terms of the context setting, people understand what the scale of this is. So when we look at government purchasing in Canada, it's about $20 billion a year, $20 billion a year. And about 23 billion of that is just the federal government. And increasingly, we're seeing governments institute supplier diversity programs, although we can talk about what the status of that is. When we look at the private sector, and Catherine mentioned working for one of the banks, about 40% of large corporations now have supplier diversity programs, and many are very sophisticated in terms of not just saying you can register here if you're in one of these categories, and many of them actually specify membership in one of the organizations listed here today. I think, we really need to underscore that certification as a woman-owned business, an Indigenous-owned business, a business owned by a racialized person, a business owned by someone who is 2S LGBTQI plus, that certification process is very, very important to preserve the integrity of the process. But at the same time, we know, and I'm going to actually ask Cassandra to kick us off. We know that the benefits of doing this are not just to the entrepreneurs, to the women or the Indigenous people or others who own the businesses. Benefits are actually to the corporations that can build resiliency and more redundancy and diversity within their supply chains. And this became very, very clear during COVID, where suddenly people had to start sourcing things locally and often didn't have the networks in place. So maybe, Cassandra, you can talk a little bit about what some of the motivations are and best practices are for the organizations you work with, whether in the private or the public sector, to really commit to supplier diversity programs.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wendy. Let me say, I love when you talked about sort of COVID, and that's a newer example, but what we've realized is the value of local networks. We heard that more than once from our corporation, because no longer could they go offshore and bring everything over at a lower reduced cost. All of a sudden that had a risk to it. So now they came back to us saying, we're looking for those local clients. We're looking for those regional clients who can actually provide, and they have a product and or service on shore. That's important to us. And so that became even more focused after the COVID. But before that time, I can strongly remember my corporate members saying to me, we know who buys our products. We know who our customer base is. We buy from them, they buy from us. This cycle of business is important. So therefore, it's not just a nice to do. And when I have corporates coming looking for suppliers, they're not just looking for diverse suppliers for the sake of ticking a box. They're looking for good suppliers. The whole purpose is if you eliminate this portion of society who have started businesses at a faster rate, which means they're more flexible, innovative, all those other things. If you ignore that portion of society and just stick with the old supply base you've had for a long time, you are not doing the best for your organization from a fiduciary responsibility. And so therefore became apparent that it wasn't just a diverse, it was about best practices to drive your business forward, competitive advantage to make sure I have the right talent at the table. That's when they came to us. So we saw it, that they started reporting from their CSR perspective, the corporate social responsibility, but it easily led into, in current time, into ESG, how they're actually driving their initiatives, how they're actually drilling down on the environmental, social, and governance portion using diverse suppliers who are connected, who are flexible or innovative, or bringing that to the table. So there's a whole host of those that I could go on, but I'll leave it there to say, Wendy, that's the essence of where we're coming from.
And maybe Daryl, you can add to this, but I think it is important to understand that the impetus for this is not sort of political correctness. The impetus for this is coming from real business realities, and then on top of that, you've got government, you've got investors, you've got consumers who are concerned about these things. And it just makes sense. Like if you're in consumer products and we know the markets are diversifying, you need suppliers who can meet those needs. So Daryl, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that we need to look at this, how we typically look at this is from an economic perspective, and the economics that comes from this. And we talked about, from a corporate side and the supplier side, but also just the broader community side in general. What happens when we're supporting marginalized businesses and SMEs in general? The more that we're helping to economically empower them, it's also helping the local communities through taxation, through employment. So all of a sudden, you're seeing stronger local economies, and that's good for everybody across the board. I think it's what's important, to go back to kind of why we're here, is that we know that diverse businesses broadly are underrepresented in corporate and public supply chains. So if we know that there's economic benefit, how do we help to make sure that those diverse businesses start to become more represented in those public and procurement, private and public procurement opportunities? When there's less than 5%, I think is probably the number here, of all diverse businesses in public procurement, something needs to change. And so that's where, supplier diversity really plays a big part of that.
Thanks so much. Stephanie, how about you? Do you want to add a perspective? Because you've got that global lens on this.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do want to reiterate, like it is a common known fact now that when we drive money into the hands of it, especially women business owners, it like they give back more to their families, to the communities, and that in turn helps our economic situation in the countries, and we see that especially as you said, Wendy, from the global lens, like in some countries where we operate, like it's a matter of survival for the women to have their own business, to be able to make those decisions and really empower their communities. In Canada, we're certainly very lucky to have so many support mechanisms and ecosystems for diverse entrepreneurs, but that is not the case everywhere around the world. But to get back to the question, so just touching on like the risk mitigation, Cassandra talked about that. The financial stability is oftentimes we find that the small diverse suppliers may be able to offer more competitive pricing and terms. They bring new ideas, their unique diverse perspectives, and they represent the communities where they come from, which are the customers of these large supply chains. And flexibility, agility, that ability to pivot is something that we've definitely seen from the diverse suppliers. And one thing that I like and that we've seen more and more in the last few years is that they're really willing to collaborate and partner, and whether that's with themselves, like the diverse suppliers themselves, or even partner with the large supply chains and like co-innovate or develop new technologies or solutions. So there's so many positive things that come from inclusive procurement, just beyond the economics.
Such a good point. And speaking of that, maybe Natalie, you'd like to jump in here.
Sure. Just building on, I think, Daryl and Stephanie's points. Increasing Indigenous procurement has repeatedly been shown to be a mechanism to improve prosperity for Indigenous people. But beyond that, improving prosperity for Indigenous people would grow the Canadian economy as well. And businesses thrive in an economy that thrives. And so if you look at that and then you consider the local aspect as well, so the benefit of knowing that the business is at least within Canada, so your dollar stays within Canada, within your economy. And research has been done to show that your dollar is actually works 4 times harder when you spend it with Indigenous businesses or diverse businesses. So An example would be for every dollar of revenue, Indigenous businesses create $4.41 of economic and social value. And this is for a variety of reasons. They tend to employ more Indigenous people, so 30 times the proportion that another business would hire. They also have more employees, interestingly, in general. They strengthen their Indigenous employees by sort of providing that training. They also often invest back into their own community. And so for those reasons, your dollar really does go further in the economy. So to me, that value alone is a good reason to.
Well, and the other thing, we're just on Monday, I think, presenting some research that we are doing on sustainability and green transition. And the research shows very clearly that Indigenous businesses led by Indigenous peoples and businesses led by women are far more likely to have sustainability as a priority. And, you know, in Indigenous communities, it has to do with looking 7 generations ahead to what the impacts can be. So anyone who's also committed to sustainability needs to definitely take a second look at supplier diversity. And Catherine, maybe you can jump in here and talk a little bit about, from your many years of experience in the banking industry, what were some of the benefits and motivations that were a priority there?
Absolutely. So I think one of the major benefits that we acknowledged when I was in my previous role on the corporate side of the of supplier diversity was when I used to have conversations with my suppliers, like, why should they join us in this journey called supplier diversity? One of the things were 3 things we talked about. One was customer. So customer satisfaction, what are you doing for your customers in the communities in which you do business? How are you managing business? How are you managing the various communities in which you do business with them? The second one is something we all are very familiar with, I think more so than we are the word supplier diversity. And that's diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization, which is all your talent internally. And taking a look at your internal talent within your FTE. But the one we want to talk about pretty much here is supplier diversity. So what is supplier diversity? So how diverse is your supply chain? Okay, and that usually comes out of your procurement group or your purchasing group, your supply chain group, whichever you call it. It's all in there. And most companies don't have that last piece, where the supplier diversity piece. So I would always say, if you're looking to have a holistic 360-degree view of being truly diverse within your corporation, do you have supplier diversity as your third piece to close that, to close that gap, to take a look at truly being diverse in nature?
And I say it a different way. I use technical terms. Are you putting your money where your mouth is? Because we have a lot of people who like to talk about their diversity commitments and wave rainbow flags and celebrate International Women's Day. But I think the litmus test really is, where are they putting their money? And that's why, it's core, even when we're looking at the 50-30 challenge, which is focused on gender parity and increased diversity on boards and in senior leadership roles. Part of the strategy has got to be also to include diversity in the supply chain. So I'm shifting focus a bit now. So we've talked about what's in it for Canada, what's in it for government, what's in it for big customers, what's in it obviously for SMEs. Where are the barriers? What are the challenges? Why, if it's such a good idea, why isn't it working to the extent that we think it ought to? And here I think, Stephanie, you might have a different perspective, but my sense is the United States, at least with certain populations, has been quite far ahead of Canada in terms of leveraging its procurement at least public procurement to build communities and stuff. But so what's getting in the way? Why aren't we doing a better job on this? Do you want to kick us off, Stephanie?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll kick us off with a story because so we go to the US quite a bit, and I also do events in Canada looking after both countries. And every time I'm out in Canada and I say, hey, supplier diversity, inclusive procurement, certification, people don't know what I'm talking about. But when I go to the US, there's always somebody in the crowd, at least one or two, but people they know what you're talking about. So to me, that is the difference, right? In the United States, it is something that is just more top of mind. Not everybody knows about it, but definitely you will find like some of them. Whereas in Canada, it's that look, oh, very interesting, never heard about this. So, I would say the lack of awareness and is like the main barrier. And then some of the others, and maybe I'll just like jot what's top of head quickly and then let my other colleagues chime in. But the networking and relationships, right? So if it's not top of mind, how are the suppliers getting into these favored or exclusive communities, especially if they're not part of any of our organizations or our network, right? You don't know what you don't know. Cassandra mentioned capital financial. So we know how difficult it is for suppliers, especially women, to get capital, and large contracts demand usually that there is a lot of capital involved. And then one that always surprises, but then it doesn't surprise me, it's the bias and discrimination. I mean, we've done some research a couple of years ago and asked for real stories from our diverse suppliers, and it was just like incredible, the stories they came back with of the bias and discrimination that they were encountering in 2023. Like, I mean, yeah. So I think those would be the biggest challenges.
Yeah, and if we're talking about bias and discrimination, I mean, maybe Catherine and Daryl, you could chime in, but I think there are other barriers as well. But Catherine, why don't you start? What do you see as some of the barriers?
So some of the barriers are well, first of all, we need to get out there and advocate more for supplier diversity across Canada, for sure. I think we're doing a great job. I've been doing this since 2009, I think, 2008, across Canada, and advocating for supplier diversity. But I think we could still continue to do a little bit better job there, especially with our governments, and really helping them understand what are some of the best practices in supplier diversity and where we're at. But some of the other barriers I see are with supplier diversity, I often see sometimes that, and this may bode more for the next question, but when I was I'll put my corporate hat on. As a large financial institution, we are governed by as we know, financial institutions and a lot of government are governed with outside governance within the federal government. And with that, sometimes a financial institution contract might be a little bit too large in scope, or the program itself may be too large in scope for some of these SMEs. And so it becomes difficult to be able to bring in from a that would be a tier 1 perspective to directly have contract direct with the supplier. So, and then it's in that aspect that what we call a tier 2 program, where we would introduce that certified supplier to one of our larger corporates, like one of the financial institutions, or one of an IBM, or one of the larger corporates, to do business for us through that avenue. it can get a little blurry at times. And I don't think we're quite there yet to really deeply dive into that tier 2 side of the purchasing processes and practices. I know more and more of our corporate members, larger corporate members, are getting into that now. But when we do, I think that'll help with the challenges to and the procurement challenges to be more resilient, to bring in more innovative organizations and suppliers into your supply chain through that tier 2 program. When we get there, we're still growing, and I don't see us there yet. But I do hope that in time, it will be more resilient to have more suppliers into your supply chain under a tier 2 program. Does that make
Thanks
sense?
much. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Daryl and then Natalie, what are some of the obstacles that you see with SMEs facing or organizations that are thinking about these programs?
Yeah, and I might start with kind of going back to your original question around kind of what are some of the barriers to just growing supply diversity here in Canada broadly. And I think the reality is quite often we think Canada is such a progressive country in that, you know, why do we need supply diversity? Because of course we're like including diverse businesses in our supply chain and in our procurement process. The reality is to my comment earlier, we know that we're not. And so something needs to change. So I think it's just that mindset, and going back to what Stephanie said, is there's so much advocacy work that still needs to happen. But if you look at, where supplier diversity originated in the US back, in the 60s during the civil rights movement, and in how it was kind of really led, which was from the government and government mandates requiring large organizations that were doing business with the federal government to have programs in place. That has not happened here to the extent that it happened in the US. And so here in Canada, it's been very much corporate driven. And so, we've talked about some of those corporations that have been leading the way, which is great. But unless that there's, in my opinion, unless there's really strong leadership, if you will, from governments saying, corporations, we need to do this. The federal government here, they rolled out a supplier diversity policy a couple of years ago, but we have yet to see the program behind that. And so again, I think that's one of the biggest barriers to really growing supplier diversity here, is that we need more governments to step up and to showcase and start to put requirements on corporations to have this. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and then I don't know, Natalie, if you wanted to build on that, or Wendy,
Well,
sorry.
And I just wanted to say, I think you've made a really important distinction building off what Catherine said, which it isn't just government needs to set targets. And we do need to talk about that, because a lot of the under 25,000, in some cases under $40,000 contracts don't have to go to tender. And that's a huge amount of money. And often government just relies on, the people that they know, and often they know people just like them, et cetera, et cetera. So there is the whole issue of how government is implementing its programs. But I think Daryl and Catherine, one of the really important points is the way in which government can use its power for those really big contracts, those billion-dollar contracts, and insist that the suppliers, those tier 1 suppliers they deal with, are actually also putting in programs to pull diverse SMEs into their value chain. I think that's something that often gets missed. Everyone thinks, it's government has to set targets. Well, yeah, they have to do that, but they can also use their purchasing power to further advance the ecosystem. Natalie, what's your experience been with Indigenous companies and their access to procurement?
I think I'll start by saying that the federal government has set targets for Indigenous businesses. So they do have a 5% of their procurement spend is with Indigenous businesses, and they have started reporting on that. So that's a positive. They also incorporate a lot of what they call IPPs, Indigenous procurement plans, into their bid process, which is where that second tier comes in. So even the second tier primary contractors are expected to incorporate and embed Indigenous businesses into their supply chain. So that really does sort of set the tone. You're right there, but that's only been, for the last few years that has been happening. And CCAB turns 40 this year. And so you have to sort of consider that for the last 25 to 30 years, it has been corporate kind of leading the way through certifications such as, well, not certifications, but programs such as PAR, like Progressive Aboriginal Relations, where corporations do join and create that path to reconciliation, where they are working to set the tone within their own businesses of what that should look like. When you talk about sort of the barriers, I think all diverse businesses probably face similar ones in terms of, first of all, sometimes the RFPs, whether they're corporate or government RFPs, are bigger than the project itself. And that can be very complicated and requires a lot of diligence. And when you imagine that most of them are SMEs, like we've said, for them to then take time out of what they're getting paid for to go and find these RFPs and then try to figure out the language and then respond to them in what can sometimes be a very short period of time is not always economical for them. So, or sometimes even the mandatory requirements, the certificates that they're asking for, or the bid bonding, or, some of those things are quite onerous. And so you have to consider whether it's worth it for them or not. I'm also noticing a lack of follow-up sometimes from corporations is a big barrier that often gets reported to us. And it seems to be coming from a lot of corporations have these supplier portals. Oh, just sign up on our supplier portal, or, get set up as a preferred vendor on our list. And then our members are kind of like, okay, I'm on the list and I'm still sitting and waiting. So a little bit of knowledge and education around what that actually means to a corporation, because they still don't get the phone call until there's a procurement that meets that exact requirement. Or and again, to the point that many of my peers have made, if they don't have that relationship already with the procurement team itself, or with whoever the contracting department is, then they still might not get that phone call. So there is difficulty in navigating and identifying who do they talk to and where and when, and a little bit of a heads up on what procurements might be coming up would really benefit them all. But if I could just speak to Indigenous, specifically businesses that are on reserve, they have an additional set of barriers in terms of the underfunding of education on these reserves, or the poor access potentially to internet in these remote areas, and then the inability to use their reserve land as collateral. So that just further complicates their ability and their interest to lenders to provide financing. So when you add all these factors in, it's, where do they spend their time growing their capacity and building their business that is going to benefit them in a way that doesn't have them sort of sitting in front of their computers trying to learn, what procurement is. We said at the very beginning, like, what even is procurement? I just have this business and I want to work with you. Just who do I talk to? So
I just have to jump in because, we have a fair amount of experience with those procurement processes, and like I have a PhD and we've lost out on some of them because one file worth 6 points wasn't uploaded, or the system crashed at the last minute. And like I said, some of those RFPs are like writing a PhD to respond to. And while I understand with big projects, like if you're building $1 billion bridge, you need that risk management. But we had a case recently where we were doing it was a $40,000 project to do an EDI strategy And it was a 160-page thing. But even better, we had to have security clearance. And I have security clearance, but the project was over and the rest of the team never got security clearance. So I had to do every piece of the project basically myself. So it's proportionality as well. It's making sure that the complexity and the burden that is put on the proponent is not excessive relative to the amount of funding, because really, what is the risk? If we're writing a $40,000 EDI strategy, like, that's people will not die, I don't think. So I just I think your points are funny. The other anecdote I just wanted to share is when we look at best practices in a lot of big organizations, and here I'd give a shout out to the government of Canada, because I think a lot of the stuff they're now doing through the is it procurement assistance services is actually what's needed. It's very focused on that capacity building, that wayfinding, that how to navigate. And that's the best practice. When you look at big corporations, they don't just set the targets, they actually try to equip people to succeed in getting the contracts. I think the two sides of it are pretty funny. But Cassandra, you also deal with lots of multinationals, and I know from looking at your list of supporters that there are some large Canadian-based corporations, but a lot of them are essentially branches of big US firms. So do you want to talk a little bit about where you see the barriers and perhaps the opportunities?
Okay. Yeah, let me just say, we can go down this list of barriers. The unfortunate thing is there's a lot of them. The biggest issue that, when we go through is that to change your process takes time. Procurement systems have been in place for a long time. They're very complex situations. And so when you want to do something around supplier diversity, you've got to start from the front end. You've got to start from, how am I collecting the data? Who do I even know is represented? Where do I get the list of them? And then when you get into the projects, you're absolutely right. Procurement systems are designed for large scale projects, for the least cost. So I'm going to give it to one. And now we're talking about smaller size businesses that range. And so now I have to take that national project, break it into regional, break it into local, and I'm not down to the lowest cost anymore. I'm down to the impact it's going to have on the community, or how am I going to manage risk. So there's so many of those payments terms are set up for big scale. I got a small business who needs that payment turned around, and you're going to wait 6 months to get your money back in to do something. I mean, you can go through from one to the other, and we've talked about networks. We have smaller scale businesses that might not be at the golf course, might not know the person. Who do I talk to? How do I get in the door? And they don't have that ability, much less the resources, because they're working in the business and not drafting the RFPs. You've got all that. When you put that on the table, when a company said, I want to do supplier diversity, it's like, oh, and I have to do all that? Let me think about that. Do you just have a name of a supplier? They jump in just at doing that patchwork thing just to do it. So there's work to be done from making sure you understand what it is, all the components you have to do, and you don't have to do them all at once. You take one by one by one. So that's why the 5% the government's doing for Indigenous, that's a great idea. There's still gaps in that process, but that's a great idea. They're starting with that. What PAC is doing from supplier assistance for supplier, fantastic idea, but we still need to get them now into the door. I mean, security clearance for government is still a big issue. From the corporate side of the house, one thing we need to be very aware of is affirmative action is under attack in the US in a big, big way. What that means, and we can all say, well, that's the US and that's not Canada. What that means is all those US companies who do business in Canada, who are doing this because it made sense and that all fit in, once they're in front of the court and they're saying, well, you're not going to be able to do that, what are they going to do in Canada? We should be concerned. That's why when we talk about doing supplier diversity, it's for the value of supplier diversity. It's not because I'm looking for a diverse supplier. It's for the value of what it brings to the table. So when I talk to you, they're looking for a great supplier who happens to be diverse. That's what they're looking for. They're looking to mitigate their risk with a local supplier who happens to be diverse. They're looking for that. So I think we cannot step away from the challenges that we thought were behind us, or that we thought we were making ground on. There's another big challenge that just jumped up in front of us that we're going to be facing as we move forward.
Yeah, and we have a question in the question box about set asides, which is the language that's often used in the US, and the status of set asides in Canada. Does someone want to answer that? Maybe Cassandra, you could.
Well, the set asides, I mean, when Natalie talked about the government 5% objectives that are set, that are put there, that they are looking to make that, and now they're rolling it across the whole of the department. So you have all the ministries now looking to say, who do we have and how do we actually start that working? Because there's not just a 5%, they have to make sure they have supports in place to make sure those suppliers who bid on the contract are successful in being able to do that. So that's the hard work that government's trying to do now. How do I put that in place? We've talked to the government indeed about having similar objectives for other diverse groups. What does that look like? And so they really, and that's a part that, because we know there's gaps in what they're doing with the Indigenous, they've really been hesitant to actually look at the other side of the house and what that actually looks like. We believe, well, some would say set aside, it's like, oh, well, you're just giving. No, we're looking at it as an objective. And that's like not a ceiling, but that's like a floor to at least make sure that people are actively looking for diverse suppliers to bring into the list. One of the best practices would be, I have to have a percentage of diverse suppliers there, but if someone just ticks a box that I looked, I couldn't find them. No, you have to come to the corporate office, or you have to come to someone and say, what did I go through to find those diverse suppliers and why I was unable, and why I used a mainstream supplier. When you have people actually go do the work to do that, suddenly they now can find, oh my God, there are diverse suppliers out there. We have to make it part of the process, that it's not just, they're not in the waiting room. Okay, let's go with it. Let's go with Joe. We've used him before, or let's go with Mary. It has to be something that they actually have to put some effort into. So set aside, if it's used as a floor, is an important aspect, but it's important because it puts objectives around and process around what people have to do to now drive suppliers into that particular area.
Yeah, it's important. And the other thing to note is it's not just at the federal level. Like, I think it was the Pan Am Games.
Yes, that's where it started.
In Infrastructure Canada's Infrastructure Ontario was involved in. We don't speak of it, but the Metrolinx project in Toronto had community set asides and so on. So for sure on some of those infrastructure projects, it's often called community benefits or other languages being used, but the concept at least is, I think, starting to take hold. Well, I hate to say this, but we're pretty much out of time. So I wanted to give each of you 45 seconds to say, like, what is the key takeaway you would like the audience to leave with? And Daryl, I'll start with you.
45 seconds. Okay. I guess maybe at the end of the day, I would say that, you know, we've been talking about governments and corporations and building out programs, but anybody can do this. I mean, I think it's really about being conscious and being considerate and being deliberate about where we're purchasing our goods or services from. So, you know, even if it's just, you know, catering or, you know, buying pencils for the office, think about where you're buying those goods and services from, and is there a diverse supplier that you can use? And then I think the second piece is leverage those supports that are out there. All of these councils are here to support you. There are corporations, there are other suppliers that have been leading this. So tap into those. There's great resources.
You know, even in our little diversity institute, it's a lens we apply when we're thinking about hiring communications consultants and services. Such a good point. We all have power, consumer power. Natalie.
Yeah, I would say, to Daryl's point, reach out to us. That's what we're here for, is to be supports for both, whether you're corporate or an Indigenous business. We're here to sort of help you bridge those gaps. And I would say, when you're looking at, if you are looking at doing diverse procurement, which hopefully we all are, that you really look at your own business and see where it applies. Like, to Daryl's point, look at your addressable spend. Where can I spend money? And then make sure that you're doing it. I think the other sort of thing that I've been noticing just working with our corporate members is set your systems up so that you're able to report on that. Set yourself some targets and be able to report on that. So the mechanism for you to be able to identify who was a woman-owned business, who was an Indigenous-owned business, and be able to report out on those successes is huge.
Thank you. Catherine.
Hi there. So I would have to say that remember that supplier diversity is a journey. It is not a project where it has a begin date and an end date. It is a journey as you go through. Rely on the councils that are here today to help and support your journey and your next steps. Take the baby steps to move forward if you're a corporation. If you're a business looking to do business, rely on the councils, become a certified business if you so are qualified, and try to identify through them. There's a lot of training. We all have a lot of training and support to help you scale up your business so that you can do business with large corporations. And just I think Wendy, you noted it before with regards to embedding supplier diversity into your supply chain if you're a corporation out there to help support. And it goes back to the information with regards that we're here to not just educate certified suppliers and how they can grow and network and work with diverse supply corporations throughout Canada and abroad. However, we're also here to help our corporates understand what the struggles are of our suppliers, our certified diverse suppliers, to help them better understand what they need to do on their end with regards to those RFPs, with regards to all those massive registration portals that have to be taken care of, and help them understand what some of the difficulties are with our members, our certified members.
Thanks so much. Stephanie, and then Cassandra.
Yeah, I'll be quick. My advice is to start now. So whether you're a large corporation or government, like why wait? I see some of them on the sidelines while they're gathering more and more information. But like Catherine said, it's a journey. So you can start small, start now. And then for the suppliers, we're seeing more and more suppliers doing supplier diversity programs, and that's really encouraging. So they're starting, so the big ones should start as well.
And last word to you, Cassandra.
Thank you so much. I love the journey begins now. I love it. Start with one step. Suppliers can buy stuff from suppliers. It's not a corporate or a government initiative. It's our initiative. You can buy from each other. Begin there. The other one is it doesn't take hold in a corporation unless it's C-suite or champion driven. We need the leaders of the organization to buy it and then drill it down to the organization, because those one-by-one procurements we make will end there and they will not build a robust economy that we need. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I thought it was an amazing conversation. Every time I get a chance to talk to you all in the room, I learn something new. So thanks to you, and thanks to our attendees, and thanks for ending on time.
Take care. Have a
Thank
great
you, everyone. Be well, be
Thanks.
safe.